I didn't know that loving my grandmother would one day make me a threat to someone else. When she died, people kept telling me how lucky I was. Lucky to be remembered. Lucky to be included. Lucky to be taken care of. They said it softly, kindly, like luck was something fragile I might drop if I held it wrong. No one warned me that inheritance doesn't just pass down money. It passes down attention, control, greed disguised as guidance. At 21, I still believed adults meant what they said. That family stepped in to protect you, not manage you out of the picture. I didn't understand how quickly the language would change from your grandmother wanted this to we know what's best for you. I didn't yet recognize how silence could be used like a leash. What happens when the person who trusted you most is gone, and the people left behind start rewriting her intentions? How do you fight something that insists it's acting for your own good? And how do you win without raising your voice? Hi, I'm Emma. And this is my story. My grandmother didn't say goodbye the way people usually do. No long speeches. No dramatic last wishes. She just looked at me quietly, closely, like she was measuring whether I'd notice something later. We were alone in her bedroom, afternoon light slicing through the blinds. Machines hummed beside her bed. She hated fuss, hated tears. Even then, she felt steadier than the rest of us. You pay attention, she said suddenly. I smiled, unsure what she meant. To what? To people, she said. Especially when they think you're too young to matter. She took my wrist, her grip thin but firm. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll read everything. Not skim. Not trust just because it's easier. That word, trust, felt heavier than it should have. I trust Mom, I said. And Richard. Her mouth tightened for half a second. I know. She leaned back. Conversation over. She passed 3 days later. At the funeral, people told me how proud she must have been. My mother cried into Richard's shoulder. He looked steady, reliable, like a man who knew how to take charge. 2 weeks later, the lawyer read the will. When he said my name followed by sole heir, my chest tightened. Richard squeezed my shoulder. We'll take care of everything, he said warmly. I smiled back, not knowing that was the moment I stopped being a granddaughter and became something else entirely. I didn't realize help could sound exactly like permission. I thought wills were supposed to make things clear. Instead, everyone read the same document and walked away with different conclusions. The lawyer's office smelled like paper and lemon cleaner. He slid the document toward me, thick and formal. My name appeared more than once: heir, beneficiary, intended successor. My mother leaned in. See, she said softly. It says I'll manage things until you're ready. Richard nodded. That's protection. How long is temporary? I asked. These things aren't rigid, Richard answered before the lawyer could. It's about maturity. The lawyer mentioned milestones, education, age, certifications. My mother waved it off. We'll handle that. After that, everything moved fast, and none of it moved through me. Richard set up meetings, took calls, created folders. When I asked questions, he smiled. Boring stuff. Focus on school. At first, it felt like relief. I was grieving. Finals were coming. Letting adults handle things felt normal. Then the language changed. Family assets, Richard said one night at dinner. Our assets? I asked. He corrected smoothly. Everyone's affected. Emails came that didn't include me. Bank updates I saw only by accident. When I asked, my mother said, "Don't stress yourself." One afternoon, I tried logging into the investment account my grandmother had shown me. Password rejected. Locked. Richard didn't hesitate when I asked. We tightened access. Security reasons. For who? I asked. For you, he said calmly. You're not ready for that responsibility yet. That night, I reread the will slowly. That's when I noticed a dense paragraph near the end. Additional provisions held in escrow. I didn't understand it yet, but for the first time, I felt like my grandmother hadn't left me defenseless. Something had been planned quietly. Richard never announced that he was taking control. That's what made it so easy to miss at first. He didn't demand passwords or slam doors shut. He offered. He stepped in. He filled the silence. Whenever something complicated appeared, He was already there, smiling, sleeves rolled up, saying things like, "I'll handle that," or "Let's not overwhelm you." At first, I let myself feel relieved. Grief had made my days heavy. College deadlines blurred together. My grandmother's absence still echoed in small, unexpected places, her chair at the table, the way I reached for my phone to call her before remembering I couldn't. Richard started answering emails meant for me, scheduling calls when I was in class, summarizing conversations afterward like recaps I hadn't asked for. "You didn't miss much," he'd say. "Just routine decisions." When I asked to be included, he smiled like a patient teacher. "You'll get there. No rush." The word temporary quietly disappeared from conversations. One night at dinner, he mentioned reallocating funds. "Our funds?" I asked. He didn't correct me right away. "Family assets," he said finally, like the distinction didn't matter. I noticed then how often he spoke for me. How questions directed at me somehow landed with him instead. How my mother looked relieved every time he took charge, like responsibility had been something she was happy to hand over. When I checked my email later that night, I realized I hadn't received a single update in weeks. Not one. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was being sensitive. That grief was warping my perception. But deep down, something had shifted. Help had become habit. And habit was becoming authority. And no one had asked if I was willing to give it up. The second account locked me out on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because it happened between classes, sitting in the campus library with my laptop balanced on my knees. I typed the password slowly, carefully, the way my grandmother had taught me: no rushing, no shortcuts. Incorrect password. I tried again. Locked. My heart sped up in a way that felt disproportionate, like my body knew something my brain was still denying. I refreshed the page. Closed the browser. Opened it again. Same result. I texted my mother first. "Do you know why I can't access the account anymore?" Her reply came 20 minutes later. "Probably security updates. Richard's been handling that stuff." When I asked him that evening, he didn't look surprised. That scared me more than anger would have. "Oh yeah," he said casually. "We tightened access." Why?" I asked. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Too many logins can raise flags. It's safer this way." "For who?" I asked quietly. He smiled, not unkindly, but firmly. "For you. You're young. You don't need that pressure yet." Pressure. Responsibility. Protection. The same words over and over, reshaped into reasons. I nodded, because pushing back felt rude. Ungrateful. Immature. But that night, I opened a notebook and started writing things down. Dates. Conversations. Who said what? When access changed. How often my name disappeared. It felt dramatic. Like something people did in movies. Still, I kept writing. Because somewhere in my chest, a door had closed. And I was suddenly very aware of the sound it made. This wasn't chaos. It was pattern. I stopped asking questions because questions gave them time to prepare answers. Instead, I started watching. Quietly. Carefully. The way my grandmother used to observe a room before she spoke. I created folders on my laptop with harmless names. School. Notes. Research. Inside them, I saved emails I was never meant to see, bank notifications forwarded by mistake, calendar invites that excluded me. I wrote dates beside conversations. I noted phrases that repeated: "for your protection, temporary, when you're ready." Nothing about it felt dramatic. There were no explosive discoveries, no shocking single moment. Just small confirmations stacking on top of each other until the picture became undeniable. Control hadn't been taken suddenly. It had been eased away while I was grieving, studying, trusting. At night, guilt crept in. I wondered if I was being suspicious. Ungrateful. If this was what adulthood looked like and I was simply behind. But every time I doubted myself, another piece of evidence appeared. Another decision made without me. Another permission revoked quietly. I realized proof isn't meant to feel satisfying in the moment. It's meant to be solid later. One evening, I compared the current account permissions to the ones my grandmother had shown me months before. My name appeared fewer times now. In some places, it was gone entirely. That was when I understood something important. Temporary arrangements don't erase people. Protection doesn't require silence. Help doesn't replace ownership. What was happening wasn't confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It was preparation, just not mine. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that realization. Because once you see the pattern, you can decide how to respond. I chose a quiet afternoon to talk to my mother. No raised voices. No accusations. Just facts, laid out carefully between us like fragile objects. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight cutting across the surface. I explained what I'd noticed. The access changes. The missing emails. The decisions made without me. I spoke slowly, giving her space to interrupt, to correct me. She didn't. When I finished, she sighed, not in surprise, but in relief. I didn't want conflict, she said. That sentence settled heavily between us. She told me Richard was stressed. That managing things kept him calm. That she thought it was temporary. That it was easier this way. Easier for her. I asked her why she hadn't told me. She looked away. I didn't want you to worry. That's when I understood. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting the peace in her marriage. And I was the variable she believed could bend without breaking. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just listened as she explained how time would smooth things out, how I'd thank her later, how family required compromise. I realized then that she had already accepted my silence as consent. That she believed my youth made my discomfort negotiable. I stood up when the conversation ended. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back, not angrily, just decisively. That moment wasn't about choosing sides. It was about recognizing where I stood. I loved my mother. But love didn't obligate me to disappear. And once I accepted that, I stopped waiting for permission. The lawyer didn't look shocked when I spoke. He didn't frown or shake his head. He listened, pen resting lightly in his hand, eyes steady. When I finished, he asked one question. Have you been restricted from accessing assets without your consent? Yes, I said. Another pause. Were those restrictions explained to you in writing? No. He nodded once. Did your grandmother ever express concern about interference after her death? My chest tightened. Yes. She warned me to read everything. That was when he mentioned the clause. Not dramatically. Not with emphasis. Just carefully, as if handling something delicate. There is a provision, he said, that remains sealed unless specific conditions are met. My hands trembled slightly. What kind of conditions? Obstruction. Unauthorized control. Reassignment of authority without consent. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life. But the dates I had documented matched exactly what he described. He explained that the clause wasn't punitive. It wasn't emotional. It didn't accuse anyone. It simply responded. Automatically. I thought of my grandmother's calm voice. Her insistence on precision. Her dislike of confrontation. This wasn't revenge. It was foresight. The lawyer told me not to act yet. To wait. To let things unfold naturally. For the first time since her death, I smiled without forcing it. Because I finally understood. She hadn't left me unprotected. She had trusted me to grow into the truth. And the truth was already moving. Richard stopped pretending everything was temporary. That was the shift I noticed first. You'll regain access when you're ready, he said one evening, like it was a promise he controlled. Not if. When. There was confidence in his voice now. Comfort. He spoke like someone who believed the structure was permanent, the outcome decided. He no longer explained changes. He informed. I listened without reacting. That seemed to unsettle him more than resistance would have. He began making plans that extended years ahead. Mentioned restructuring. Long-term positioning. Used language that erased my timeline entirely. My mother nodded along, grateful someone else was steering. I realized then that Richard believed youth was a weakness he could outlast. That if he waited long enough, I'd accept whatever remained. What he didn't understand was that silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's preparation. A week later, he mentioned consolidating accounts for efficiency. I asked one neutral question. He waved it away. Trust me, he said. That word no longer had power over me. I watched carefully as he signed documents I wasn't shown. As confirmations arrived in inboxes that excluded my name. as authority shifted further without resistance. He thought he had time. That was his mistake. Because comfort breeds carelessness. And carelessness leaves records. I didn't need to stop him. I only needed him to continue. And eventually, he crossed the line himself. The lawyer called me quietly. No urgency. No alarm. The clause exists, he said. And it's enforceable. He explained it slowly, ensuring I understood every word. The safeguard wasn't emotional or reactive. It didn't depend on my feelings or intentions. It depended on behavior. If authority was obstructed, it responded. If control was misused, it shifted. Automatically. I imagined my grandmother drafting it, calm and thorough. Anticipating not malice, but human nature. She hadn't assumed betrayal. She'd prepared for possibility. The clause didn't accuse Richard by name. It didn't condemn anyone. It simply protected the heir of me from being quietly erased. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. This wasn't about winning. It was about alignment. Restoring what had already been decided. The lawyer asked if I wanted to proceed. I told him to wait. Timing mattered. Evidence mattered. Letting things unfold naturally mattered. When I hung up, I sat in my car and breathed deeply. I wasn't angry. I wasn't scared. I was clear. For weeks, I had wondered if I was overreacting. If this was just adulthood arriving awkwardly. Now I knew better. My grandmother hadn't given me power immediately. She had given me a moment. One that would arrive only when I could recognize it. And that moment was approaching. Because interference doesn't stop once it starts. Richard didn't tell me about the transfer. I found out through a notification I wasn't meant to receive. A system alert sent automatically, triggered by activity that exceeded his assigned authority. He called it efficiency later. Optimization. Consolidation. The system called it interference. The lawyer confirmed it the next morning. That action qualifies, he said simply. There was no drama. No confrontation. Just confirmation that a line had been crossed. I thought about warning Richard. About stopping it. But that would have been interference of my own. So I waited. The safeguard didn't activate loudly. There were no alarms. No announcements. Just quiet shifts behind screens and signatures. Permissions adjusted. Authority rerouted. Controls reassigned. Richard continued his day unaware. He spoke confidently at dinner, planning ahead, discussing futures he believed he owned. I listened without comment. Later that night, I checked my email. One new message. Subject line neutral. Content brief. Transfer of authority completed. I closed my laptop and sat still. No rush of satisfaction. No urge to confront. Just a deep, steady calm. He hadn't lost control because I fought him. He lost it because he ignored the rules. And the rules had been written long before either of us imagined this outcome. He wouldn't realize what happened until it was irreversible. The confirmation arrived without ceremony. No congratulations. No apology. Just documentation. Authority transferred. Access restored. Control reestablished. To me. I logged into the account slowly, deliberately. Everything was there. Untouched, but no longer reachable by him. The lawyer reminded me that nothing about this was emotional. It was procedural. Clean. Final. By the time Richard noticed, it was already done. He confronted me that evening, confusion flickering across his face before irritation settled in. He demanded explanations. Asked what I'd done. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I told him to speak to the lawyer. My mother watched silently, realization dawning too late. The room felt different now. Not tense, balanced. Power hadn't shifted violently. It had returned to where it belonged. I felt older in that moment. Not hardened. Just steadier. There was no satisfaction in watching him struggle to understand what happened. Only clarity. This wasn't punishment. It was correction. Later, alone, I reread my grandmother's old notes. Her handwriting neat, deliberate. She had trusted systems more than speeches. Preparation over confrontation. I understood her fully then. She hadn't wanted me to fight. She had wanted me to stand. And standing didn't require noise. Richard wanted an argument. I could see it in the way he paced, in the sharpness of his questions, in the volume of his voice. I didn't give him one. I answered calmly, briefly, without defensiveness. Each response closed a door rather than opening one. That unsettled him more than anger would have. He accused me of manipulation, of ingratitude, of betrayal. I listened until he finished, then told him the conversation was over. Not dramatically, just firmly. I walked away. Later, my mother asked how I could be so cold. I told her it wasn't coldness. It was clarity. I wasn't responsible for managing his emotions. I wasn't obligated to soften consequences. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in months. Because peace finally felt earned. After everything settled, I didn't rush to celebrate. There was no urge to announce anything or prove I'd won. Instead, I slowed down. For the first time, the decisions were mine, and that weight deserved respect. I met with advisors quietly. Asked questions I'd once been told were too complicated. Took notes. Read documents line by line, the way my grandmother had always insisted. I learned where the money sat, how it moved, what it supported. I learned which structures protected it and which exposed it. Nothing about it felt glamorous. It felt careful, responsible, almost sacred. I made changes gradually. Reorganized accounts. Adjusted access. Established boundaries that didn't depend on trust, but on clarity. I didn't erase anyone out of spite. I simply restored roles to where they legally and ethically belonged. What surprised me most was how calm I felt. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of revenge. Just alignment. Like something that had been tilted for months finally stood upright again. I thought about how often people confuse inheritance with reward, as if money is a prize instead of a responsibility. My grandmother had never treated it that way. She had treated it like a tool, useful only if handled with care. Every decision I made carried her voice in it. Slow down. Read again. Don't assume good intentions replace safeguards. I understood then that she hadn't been testing me. She had been preparing me. Money fades. Accounts change. Structures evolve. But wisdom, that stays. And that was the real inheritance she left me. Because understanding her gift changed how I saw myself. There are moments when life doesn't end with noise, but with stillness. This was one of them. I stood alone in my apartment one evening, the city quiet outside my window, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not excitement. Not relief. Certainty. The kind that doesn't need validation. I thought about my grandmother, not as she was at the end, fragile and tired, but as she'd always been. Precise. Observant. Unmoved by chaos. She had never rushed me. Never doubted me. She had simply waited. People had told me I was too young to understand what she'd left me. Too inexperienced to handle it. But she hadn't measured readiness by age. She'd measured it by awareness. By patience. By whether I'd notice when something felt wrong. She knew I would hesitate before reacting. That I would listen before speaking. That I would document before accusing. Those weren't weaknesses. They were foundations. I realized then that the delay wasn't about control. It was about timing. She hadn't wanted me to inherit power immediately. She wanted me to grow into it, without bitterness, without spectacle, without losing myself. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't expose anyone. I simply stepped into what had already been mine. That night, I whispered thank you into the quiet room, not for the money, but for the trust. She had believed in who I would become. And in the end, she was right. I didn't inherit her strength. I discovered it in myself.